Hi, my name is Jim Parker. Welcome to Boss Talk. This is my business partner, Carey Sobel.
Thank you for joining us. Today's episode is Finding the Right Buyer. We previously did an episode called How to Be a Good Buyer, but today we're talking about the flip side of it. So finding the right buyer from a seller's perspective. And you may think that it's just based on what we said before, the highest price, but it's actually the best terms and best price. And the terms is relative to the type of buyer that you're actually looking for. So we're going to break today into three different categories. Working with people you like, working with the buyer that gives you the best chance to close, and working with the buyer that you want to work with for the long term.
Yep.
And every piece of information that we have can be in those three categories. So plain and simple, choosing the right buyer that you enjoy working with. This is a taxing process. This is arduous, but it's a hell of a lot easier if you're working with somebody you like.
Yeah, come on, Carey. It's a lot of this is that we're working in a situation where it's not like we're selling something and somebody's walking away that day. We're looking anywhere from 30 days, 90 days, or longer from the time we go under contract to the time we're able to close.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a lot of interactions there with that seller, and I think it's very, very important that the buyer and the seller like each other and trust each other.
And it sounds kind of practical and basic to say, but I've done deals where buyer and seller did not like each other at all, and it was terrible. And it just makes for a more pleasant experience when people enjoy who they work with. And one of the things we talked about is the buyer that you're looking at, are they a good cultural fit for the team that they are going to inherit?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So if employees are staying on, the relationship of those employees with the current owner is definitely going to be different than the new owner.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to make it as seamless as a process as possible. We don't want to see staff attrition and people leaving because they don't like the new buyer, but the cultural fit's really important. And an indicator of this is when a buyer is going through the process and they're just looking at numbers. They're just asking questions about the business, and they haven't asked any question about the staff.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't asked
and
about
the culture and how you treat the staff, what's your management style, all that culture plays a huge part in trying to pick the correct buyer. Absolutely.
Most businesses are very much reliant on the employees, and the employees' happiness is critical to the success of the business. So when a seller is talking about things that they do in their business, from employee appreciation days to PTO policies to anything at all about the culture, getting together after work with the team, anything that makes up the DNA and culture of the team, it's really important that buyer's asking those questions.
I've got an extreme example, and I'm going to be very careful in saying this because I don't want to give up my political viewpoints. But I was working with a couple of buyers, and another broker had the listing. So we were going to do a co-broke situation. And my buyers were two men, and they were a couple. They were homosexual, very nice couple. Well, we went into the business, and all over the entire facility, especially in the owner's office, it was all MAGA stuff.
Mm.
And obviously right away, even if not all the employees, it would have just been a huge cultural fit. I mean, problem. As soon as we walked in, it was like realized, these two guys coming into this situation where there was so much MAGA memorabilia, it's obviously not going to be a good fit between them and the culture of the business.
You guys didn't talk about that before the showing?
No, we had no idea. We had no idea. It was the first time because I was working with the buyers. It wasn't my listing.
Sure.
So I had no idea. And the listing agent didn't tell me that. And I don't blame him either. It was just, we went in there, and within 30 seconds, we were like, this is probably not going to be a good cultural fit between the two.
Interesting. I don't have one that extreme. But, I think a part not necessarily relative to culture is, the communication style.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot of business owners that treat their employees like family. They've been working for 20, 30 years. And the way that they're going to talk to employees is going to be different than maybe an incoming buyer or a private equity group or somebody who's from the corporate structure.
Yeah, but it's more hard-nosed and more laying down the line. Because there is I think that's a good thing to touch on for a little bit, Carey, because, I think in small business, when you own a small business, you almost become friends or very friendly with your employees. A lot of the business owners that I work with, one of the things that they say is, I really want to make sure my employees are taken care of. You get to really know the employees. You get to know their families. And I think when somebody's come from the corporate world where they're used to managing a much bigger staff and then you're coming into a situation where you only have 6, 7, 10 employees, It's a completely different management style.
Yeah. And beyond communication from incoming buyer to the employees, passing on from seller to the employees, is the communication process throughout the deal, right?
Mhm.
So first buyer seller meeting to due diligence, the way that they're asking questions.
Yep.
There's oftentimes that ego-driven conversations completely cannibalize a transaction. If a seller is going to sell and the buyer comes on and they're pounding their chest about what they've done before and driving with ego, it's going to put a bad taste in the seller's mouth.
Yeah.
Now, at the end of the day, the goal is to consummate a deal and for the seller to cash out and the buyer to acquire the business. But along the way, how you approach due diligence, how you approach difficult conversations, that communication style is critical.
And that, again, we're going from, anywhere from 30 days to 90 days in a closing period. So there's a lot of things that need to happen during that time period. A lot of things the seller needs to do, a lot of things the buyer needs to do. And, everybody has to kind of work together to get through that, to get to the end. And, Carey, real quick, because I have to say this is, when and I know you and I talk about this stuff all the time, when I'm being selective on the listings that I'm going to take on, obviously it's got to be a good business. The seller's got to be realistic about the asking price. And a third component to that is that I have to like and trust the seller.
Yeah, of course.
Because my feeling is like, if the reason I look at it that way is multiple reasons. One is is this somebody I'm going to be happy with working, trying to sell their business, because we're going to work very closely together for a long period of time. And the other part of that is I don't want to look over my shoulders post-closing if the seller is not telling the truth. I don't want to look over my shoulders as a broker. But another component to that is that I really believe a buyer's got to like and trust a seller. And if I don't like and trust the seller, chances are maybe a buyer is probably not going to like and trust the seller. And on the flip side of that, I think it's extremely important that a seller likes and trusts the buyer. That seller-buyer relationship, I think, is so, so important. Put the price aside, put the terms aside. Do they get along?
Yeah, I mean, it's transparency, right? I mean, it's honesty, dealing honestly. And it's an emotional process for a seller to sell the business if the buyer is not going to appreciate the sensitivity of it.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the seller is not emotionally attached to their business, but most times they are.
They are.
So it's really important that it's a friendly approach. But again, anytime you feel, or a buyer or seller feel like the other one's trying to get one over on them, or they're not being open and honest and transparent, it really creates deal fatigue, and it prevents a deal from getting across the finish line.
And you got to remember the transition period post-closing too.
Oh, that's
the buyer's going to have to, the seller's going to have to train the buyer post-closing. And, that could be anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, 6 months to a year, who knows? It depends on how the things are structured. But, that's another reason why they need to get along, because they're going to be working together for quite a while.
And if, with our first chapter being people you like, the beginning parts of a transaction where buyer and seller meet each other for the first time, you really want to establish the rapport first. The small talk's important. Finding out, what hobbies and interests do you have? Well, they don't have to necessarily align, but I think an important part is, what are the buyer's motivations and what are the buyer's intentions with the business?
Mm-hmm.
Are they looking to grow it? Are they buying a job? Why does the buyer want the business? What is the reason that attracted them to it? Is it just a job? Or, are they already retired and they're looking for something that they want to do that's passionate to them? And then there's intent influences from the buyer, like talking about, well, we want to grow viciously. We want to make staff changes right away.
Yep.
All of these things are critical because the seller, again, price terms, but what about all the other attributes? I had one seller that was completely adamant that there were going to be no staffing changes when the buyer took over. And the buyer had a hard time with that because they saw some holes that they could either plug in or people that they could let go to chop some expenses off. But the seller was like, I want to put it in the contract that you're not going to terminate anybody for X period of time. We eventually worked past it.
Yeah, but that's a hard one. That's a hard clause to put in there.
They're the type of approaches that some of these sellers take. And it's, when we're selling a Main Street business specifically, or even an upper Main Street, lower middle market business, those buyers or sellers are a lot more attached to their business. Mm-hmm. So understanding what the buyer is going to do after they take over is a pretty big part of this.
It is, and I say about a year ago, maybe it was a year and a half ago, I did a deal where the buyer didn't tell the seller or me this. And the buyer had said that they're going to keep everything the same. And, maybe this is more of a conversations that me and the seller should have had. I mean, we all, make mistakes. And it was not a repair shop. And 2 weeks after we closed, the buyer came in and told the employees it was a Monday through Friday shop. And he came in and said, okay, we're now going to be Monday through Saturday. So now you got techs. They're used to being home with their family, with their kids, doing family stuff. All of a sudden being told, yeah, we're going to start working Saturdays. That went over like a lead balloon,
I bet.
and that hurt the seller too. You know what I mean?
course.
Because the seller's like, he wants to make sure his employees are taken care of. And it's not a good situation for the buyer either. But I think you're absolutely right. Knowing the intentions of the buyer post closing is extremely important.
And, there's stuff that you can do aside from ask the questions directly, right? When a buyer and a seller meet each other for the first time, they're probably a little apprehensive about diving deep into what are you going to do with the business afterwards, right? But there are things that a seller can do leading up to a conversation with the buyer. I always give my sellers at least a bio or a snippet or a resume or something about who they're looking at. I'll send them a link of their LinkedIn profile. But the reputation and professionalism of the buyer is paramount. And a buyer's reputation matters more than the offer amount. If I've had a buyer before that had a criminal record.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as the seller found that out, they did not care about any of the details. They walked away. They said, I do not want to talk to this buyer. And that's an extreme case. But, you can do things as far as looking at the buyer's previous businesses and reviews about them, or Googling their name and just finding out what can you grab onto to get some background information to preface the conversation, but finding out how the buyer has treated past employees, how they've handled past transactions,
what their management style is, how they approach it.
Because sellers are going to talk to their team at some point. We usually encourage it to be, the day after the closing has happened or the day of the closing. But there's times before where a seller will tell their staff what's going on. And it's great to be like, here's who you're going to be working with. And here's what I know about them. And here are the red flags that I've seen. And here are all the good things that I've seen. But if you leave it up to assumption, it's lethal.
Yeah.
You may have a buyer that comes in to introduce themselves to the employees of a business they just acquired, and they come in with an iron fist and we're going to go do this and we're going to go do that. And that might not be the way that the staff wants to be received,
Right.
So
and that could hurt the business.
Absolutely.
And that could hurt everything. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the first thing we're talking about is, if you're a seller, go beyond the price and terms. Look at, do you like the person?
Mm-hmm.
For God's sakes, for most small business owners, they spend years building their business. It's their baby. It's their passion. That's what they lived and breathed for years. You want to give it over to somebody. You want to pass that on to somebody that you actually like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And be like, oh yeah, every time you drive by, you're like, yeah, that's right. I'm really glad John bought the business. He's a great guy.
And that first chapter of work with somebody that you like, again, it's logical, but I think we pointed out a couple tips for these sellers and what they can look at. But the next point, I remember when we were going over this one, was working with a buyer that has the best chance to close.
Oh yes, that's a big one.
So again, if you're going to sell to somebody and that person is providing a above market offer or above value offer, you may get all wide-eyed and excited about it, but does it mean they can actually get to the closing table?
Yep.
Because so many deals die before they do.
Yep. Are they actually going to get financed from the bank? Where's the money coming from? They actually going to be able to get that money. It could come down to just simple things too, as well as, they have the net worth that they are going to be able to get the lease in their name.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a franchise being sold, they're going to get the franchise in their name. I mean, there's other components and third parties you have to worry about, when you're doing a transaction.
And a couple of the topics we have underneath here is, experience. So sellers should choose a buyer who has experience in their industry.
Or relatable experience.
It doesn't need to be direct.
It doesn't have to be direct, but if they have strong management experience or strong sales experience, and that can be converted over to what their role in the company is, great.
When we're selling jobs or Main Street businesses, in most cases, you do see an industry switch. Buyer was getting sick and tired of working as an accountant for a CPA firm, so now they want to try
owning a business.
Right. Now, if that business is being the general manager of a restaurant, it doesn't really make any sense.
No.
But if somebody's coming from a Fortune 500 sales organization and they want to take over a small business that is running great, but they're just not growing revenue because they need an established sales team or a sales executive, that makes sense.
Yeah, it might be a good fit.
But understanding the buyer's experience, not just their ability to get across the finish line financially, but a lot of landlords or third parties that govern a transaction or have contingencies related to them are also going to ask about the experience. Like SBA, for example, they take into consideration the person that's going to get the loan. Well, what have they done in the past?
That's relatable.
Is this person
Or direct
collectible?
experience.
Does this person have any
Yep.
experience in running this business? They're taking a risk by putting the loan out. They want to make sure that this incoming buyer has credibility and experience.
And obviously, having the experience to run the business, whatever that is, that is going to reflect on how, reflect on the employee's success. It's going to reflect on how the customers are treated, how the suppliers are being treated, and how the overall business is doing well. And I'll tell you, it's not even things like that. It could be as simple as this. I know this is going to sound odd, but like when me and my team are interacting with buyers looking at a business, the buyers, are asking questions. And sometimes, you get questions that come over and there's 100 questions. And, we do a very thorough sim.
Yeah.
We do a video interview of the seller, which is embedded into the sim. We provide a lot of information. And when you see 100 questions, it's kind of like, this person is going to be very, very difficult all the way through because they're going to be asking a trillion questions. And when I say that, Carey, that sounds horrible because I think every buyer should have the opportunity to do their due diligence, to know what they're buying. But, everybody's buyer's due diligence is from, I've seen people that barely do any due diligence. And I've seen people like scour through it like they're buying
Forensic
a $300 million
accounting,
business.
Yeah.
And, I think everybody should have that due diligence period, but like, you want a buyer that's not going to be picky about every little thing. I mean, I one time had a buyer that asked what the $300 miscellaneous expense was from 3 years before. And the business was making like over $500,000 a year. It's kind of like, who really cares what the $300 miscellaneous expense was 3 years ago when we're not even under contract yet?
Yeah.
And it's those kind of like, so it's the really little tiny detailed questions or tons of questions. It's kind of like, this person's going to be very, very nitpicky about every little thing.
And it's interesting too, because, we talk about professional buyers versus like, a one-time buyer, and we work with all of them. We work with the person who left corporate America that wants to chase the American dream.
The industry buyer, the private equity group, the family office.
And then the ones that are professional buyers like that, you have the ability to dive in and find out what is their track record of acquiring businesses.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at some of their add-ons or even their platform businesses and ask, how did this transaction go? Or maybe ask the seller from the business, how was your experience working with this buyer? Now, maybe a little extreme. I haven't actually encouraged that before, but with the different types of buyers that come across the table, the seller should be doing as much due diligence as they can on the buyer while the buyer is looking into the business.
Yep.
And if you can get information about their track record in previous transactions or, their personal background, I think it really does help.
Yeah, I do too.
And a proven operator investor that has done this before will have workflows and processes for their due diligence. So you mentioned 100 question DD list.
And that's before we even go under contract.
Well, that's a whole nother ballgame. But I've had a lot of buyers that go to ChatGPT or go download a typical due diligence list, and they'll just send the whole list over to the seller, regardless of whether the questions are even applicable to the business.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's stuff like
or
that.
information that's already in the sim or that they're asking. It's like that always gets something. I'm sorry to cut you off.
It drives me nuts.
It drives me nuts because it's like, okay, this buyer's obviously not that interested in this particular business.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say they're not a serious buyer, but they're obviously not very interested in this particular business because they haven't taken the time to really read the sim.
Yeah.
They're asking these questions.
I'm in the process. Just put a business under LOI. It's a really nice business. And we got 7 LOIs in a week period, and the seller needed to decide who they wanted to move forward with. And we narrowed it down to 2. And the deciding factor between the 2 was which one is going to be easier to get through due diligence with.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them had already talked about, this is a $7-8 million business. So they're doing a buy side quality of earnings. They're going into extreme detail for the business, as they should. But the way that they put the questions up, the way they asked them, it's almost like they were belittling the seller.
Yeah.
And when the seller was asking questions about them, the buyer was just like, oh, this is normal practice. And it just didn't feel right. And that was ultimately what drove the seller to pick the opposing party.
Yeah. It's funny because you see that sometimes buyers get on the phone with a seller and the buyer-seller phone call, and the buyers act like they have the upper hand and they are, interviewing the seller, kind of like, which they should be asking the questions, but they're almost like, you're on the hot seat, seller. And the buyer's got to realize you're on the hot seat too.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Because when you have, because we're selective on the businesses we take to the
Mhm.
market. We talked about this. We're selective on the business we take to the market, and then we go full force when we go to the market with those listings. So we do get most of the time we get multiple offers on our listings. And so, we have the seller has a choice,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, who they want to go with. And I don't think some buyers realize that.
They don't. They come into it like they're holding the golden egg, but
Yeah.
they're not.
I've got the money. I'm the buyer,
Buyers are a dime a dozen. We know that. And, buyers that come to the table that are pleasant to deal with, have the experience, appreciate what the seller's bought, appreciate what they're going through emotionally to go through it. It's critical. And when we talk about the buyer that has the best chance to close, a big part of that is their financial capabilities.
Yeah.
So, we do as much upfront qualification as we can before we bring what we'll call a qualified buyer to the table for the seller. So some of the things that we're going to look at, proof of funds, banking relationships, experience closing deals of a similar size, a clean and realistic capital structure, because a high offer doesn't mean anything if that buyer doesn't have any money or doesn't have the ability to get funding. So beyond the actual purchase price, sellers need to ask those same questions. Of course, they're relying on us to have done a certain amount of due diligence prior to releasing the information. But when we get into that true DD process and we have a 60-day time period for them to go get financing, we sometimes put some checks and balances in there where we're reaching out to the bank that's working with the buyer, getting the banker's perspective. If you trusted every buyer's word, I don't think we get any deals done.
Right. An interesting thing, you were talking about that deal that you were doing, and I had a deal similar. And we had about that many offers too. It was a couple of weeks ago. We had about that many offers too at one time, and we narrowed it down to 3 buyers. And the third buyer, there was, ranked at number 3, and we went back to those 3 buyers and we did another buyer seller interview with those buyers. And it was funny. We had already ranked number 1, number 2, number 3. And when we jumped on the phone with everybody, number 3 ended up being the number 1. And that's who we ended up going with.
What was the
just
big
because
change?
of the second phone call?
What was the big change?
The buyer just on the second phone call, that buyer was just, his personality was showing, his enthusiasm for the acquisition of the business was showing. He just came across so enthusiastic and so excited about the business, and the seller loved that.
Are you under contract with a third buyer now?
We are under contract with that third buyer now.
Awesome.
So
it's really hard to, like, when we had those 7 offers and I had to send the email to the other 6 that you weren't selected. 5 of the 6 wrote back, "Thanks for the time. Would love to be a backup, yada, yada, yada." The 2 that it was down to, the one that didn't get selected, radio silence. And then a week later started texting the seller directly, some pretty aggressive messages.
Wow.
Which is I'm not going to call it circumvention, but it's the type of thing where we, the seller and myself, both felt validated for the choice that was actually
absolutely
made.
That kind of cements she chose the right person. And you know what, when that happens, when a situation like that happens, what we do at our company is that's reported to our admin staff, and then our admin staff puts a note next to that buyer in our CRM. And it's very difficult for a buyer like that to get information on the next business. So
And working with a buyer that has the best chance to close, one more topic in here is really buyer preparedness and professionalism during the due diligence process. So how a buyer behaves during due diligence will typically be a good forecast on how they're going to operate afterwards. Some red flags, them being disorganized or having slow responses. Sometimes the slow responses are intentional to make them feel like, you want me, you need me.
Yeah.
Constant negotiation. Talk about retrading deals.
Yeah,
Sure, if things come up number wise, yes. But when things pop up during due diligence that are a big deal, I personally prefer when a buyer goes through their entire DD process and then provides their findings with the suggestion.
I agree, because I think it's really important when you're negotiating, because there are times, you negotiate up front, you go under contract, and then you go through your due diligence, and then you might have to renegotiate again if the numbers don't add up, and something that came up in due diligence, you have to renegotiate again. No matter when you're negotiating, it's always important to negotiate all the stuff at one time. So like what you're talking about, you go under contract, you're doing the due diligence, something pops up in due diligence, you don't want to immediately, and it's a big deal, and the seller understands it's a big deal, and the seller understands that they have to renegotiate. You don't want to renegotiate until you've explored everything.
Yeah.
So you can negotiate everything at one time.
We finished up a buy side QOV this morning, and I got a list of here are all my findings, here are my assumptions, which they called out, which I loved because they called out the fact that there were assumptions that needed validation. I saw this, so I'm thinking this. Am I right or am I wrong?
Right.
So
That's a good approach.
And they didn't even put out their negotiation yet, which they will be doing. And I prepped my seller for that. But this buyer just from the very beginning was very fun to work with. There was great synergy between buyer and seller. Seller actually in this deal picked a lower offer because the buyer.
I see that quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, they meshed well. They were similar age groups. And it just seemed like the seller's not rolling over equity. They're getting completely out of the business. It's a 1-month transition period, but the seller trusted the buyer that he was going to come in and run the business and treat the people the right way and was going to do nothing to disrupt what's currently happening and provided some good upside opportunities that would take care of the staff, not the seller, because the seller's not going to be involved.
I tell you, Carey, what I really like about that story you just told about that buyer, to me, that buyer is a good quality buyer because that's a buyer that's saying, hey, these are the things that I found. These are my assumptions. Are these assumptions correct? Before just jumping to conclusions and saying, this is my new price, or this is what I want to negotiate, blah, blah, blah. He wants to verify if what he's seeing is true and correct. Because that sometimes, I get a call from a buyer and the buyer's like, oh, we're going to have to renegotiate, blah, blah. And you start talking to the buyer and you realize the buyer's missing something.
Yeah. Slow down a second.
Slow down.
Let's discuss the facts.
Yeah, it's and hey, I think you missed. Oh, I did miss that. Yeah. Okay, great. And that's a good sign of a good buyer that understands. Hey, I want to make sure what I'm seeing is true and accurate. Yeah. And obviously, if the seller said it's not, then that has to be proven still. But that's the first step.
We talked about professional buyers. Most professional buyers will conduct themselves that way, but a lot of time we're dealing with people that are buying a business for the first time. That's where our role is even more critical, to walk them through the process, educate them the best way to do it to where it's tasteful on either side.
I think it's critical to do it the other way too, because you don't know if the buyers are taking advantage of you, because they are professional buyers and they buy businesses all the time.
That's very true.
So,
and to preparedness and professionalism, some green flags, quick follow through, constant communication, realistic requests instead of just sending over a pre-formatted DD list, and focusing on big issues, not nitpicking like the $300 one charge.
Miscellaneous charge 3 years ago. Come on, who cares?
The third part that we had talked about finding the right buyer, is working with a buyer that you want to work with for the long term. The day of closing, it's not over. In fact, I think some of the most frantic points of a deal are after the deal is closed. Buyers a little overwhelmed with just acquiring a business, taking out a loan or putting up all the cash. Sellers relaxed that the deal's done.
Yeah.
But and there's a lot of different cases of where post-closing is even more important, especially for equity rollover. Mm-hmm. So I want to dive into that a little bit, and we'll explain to the audience what equity rollover is. Essentially, if a seller is selling the business and they are going to roll over equity, it means that they are going to hold back a portion of the funds that they would receive for the full value of the business to essentially buy back into that new company, mm-hmm. or a larger company that the group that's buying the business already owns. So if you're supposed to get $5 million and you're going to roll over 20%, maybe you get $4 million. Now you own 20%.
But you keep 20% of the equity. And like you said, it could be in that particular company that the buyer's buying, or a lot of times the buyer's got a bigger business that is acquiring all these different businesses. So you're getting the rollover equity not in the company that they're buying, but you get into the bigger company. Obviously, the equity would be a lot smaller.
Yeah,
but yeah.
And there's advantages.
I'm glad you explained that, because you mentioned rollover equity a couple of times. I was wondering. I wonder if the audience knows what that is. So I'm glad you took the moment to explain.
It's becoming even more and more common, and you got to think about it from a buyer's perspective, right? So if the seller has ran the business for 30 years and they're a critical part of the business, and a private equity group is coming in to buy the business, their insurance policy is based on the person that was running the business before. Mm. And if they can attach that person to stay inside of the business, which they'll do in a number of different ways, earnouts and performance notes and equity rollover, it is essentially asking that seller to bet on the continuity of the business or the potential growth in the business that they were probably using as a tool to sell it. Mm-hmm. So those private equity groups, what they'll do is when they offer that rollover equity, there's usually something tied to it of that seller's involvement,
like a position on the board.
Are you going to just
do a consultant?
Right.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's rollover equity and continue to be the CEO and run the company, right?
Yep.
So in those instances, it's even more important for the seller to like, and not the group that's buying them, but not only like them, trust and believe in what they're capable of doing. If you're selling the business, you probably want to take some money and put it in your pocket, take some chips off the table. But if you do believe in your business,
and you believe in the buyer and their business,
then it's more the reason to roll the equity. But it's even more important to believe in that group as opposed to just a larger dollar figure. You know, sometimes sellers are just like, I want to get as much money as I can and walk away. I get it. I would want to do that. But if the group that's coming in has so much synergy with the current business, and that seller is like, I really like what they could do for this business. They could introduce me to these people. They could provide me these resources. And I know what that can do. Well, maybe you want to go for the ride again.
Yeah. I mean, you look at a private equity group, a lot of times they have like a back end, accounting and back end HR, they have back end all this stuff. So immediately the business that they're acquiring, getting all that back end support staff. And then on top of that, they could have deep pockets where they're going to pour more money into the business and grow. I mean, what they're trying to do is they're buying up these businesses all over the place, wrapping it into one big company, with the end result down the road, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whenever it is, to sell off a much bigger business. So as a seller of a business, why would you want to do rollover equity? Well, like you said, you're getting some of the chips off the table right away. If you believe in the buyer and you believe in their company, and they are going to keep growing, and they've got a plan of an exit plan of whether it's 5 years or 10 years, whenever it is, and you can get a piece of that, and you believe in them, you could end up getting a second bite of the apple. Meaning
that's bigger than the first.
That's bigger than the first bite of the apple. Even though you own less stock, it could end up being a bigger bite.
I had an example of this today. Working with a seller, we're bringing their business to market in January. When we first met, they said, when I retire, I want to retire. I'm out. I don't want to roll equity. I don't want to hold the note. I want all my cash up front. First, I said, good luck. Then, as recently as today, when we were going through the growth strategy for the business, it became very evident that the only reason the seller's leaving is because they want to focus on their family. Mm-hmm. They could take this business to a whole nother level. They've intentionally kept it at the level that they had. They went from 3.5 to 5.5 this year. Million. Yeah. And next year on the books, it would be very tough to not do 6.5. And they're getting knocks at the door to expand their geographic coverage and everything. They have the plan to scale. They know what to do. And I asked them, why don't you want to do it? I just don't care. I'm already retired. I have enough money. Of course, I would love more money, but it's not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Carey, I hear that all the time. I hear that all the time. Business owners like, hey, they're 65 or 67 or 62, and like their business hasn't grown very much in the last 5 years. They're just like, hey, I hit a certain point. I'm happy. I'm making good money. And, every time you grow, you have to put more resources in it, more time.
Yeah.
And they're just like, hey, I'm done growing. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy the fruits of the labor. And that kind of seller, you see it a lot, and it's good for the buyer because the buyer's coming in and going, hey, the seller is just kind of maintained for the most part the last 5 years. I'm coming in, I'm a lot younger, and I'm, going to be more aggressive. I'm going to put the foot on the, the metal on the pedal, and what is it? Foot on the pedal
to the metal.
Pedal to the metal and freaking take off,
And this particular seller, I said, you're primed for growth. And he goes, well, that's the opportunity. Because when he first came to me and I told him what his business was worth, it was almost double what he thought he could get for it. And
that's unusual.
It is very unusual.
It's usually half.
This is an ideal seller. But by the end of the conversation, I was talking about the concept of rolling over equity. And I said, if you believe in your business this much and you're just not doing it, and I was like, you're talking to me now. We're not selling the business to a third party. You're talking to me. And he goes, I believe in all of this thoroughly. I said, well, when you take your money from the sale, there's going to be a piece of it that you're probably going to go invest somewhere. Is that investment, what you're going to go make, have a better chance to produce a larger return wherever you're going to put it, or giving it to somebody else to take the 25-year history of the business you built and put some resources to it that you've never had to grow it?
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it.
And by the end of that conversation, he goes, I'm open to rolling up to 25% equity in the business. And I said,
which makes it appealing to buyers. Even if a buyer doesn't want to do rollover equity, they look at it and go, The seller has faith in the business.
You took the words out of my mouth, and that's exactly the point I was getting across. Is like, when
I took the big win.
the thunder.
You told the story, and then I just came in.
No,
and
it's perfect.
Told you the punchline.
But I mean, it's the truth, and it's this type of consultation and advisory that we provide that helps sellers understand the process. You know, this seller wasn't even going to sell their business; they were just going to close. They were referred to me, and I showed them, you know, the money that they could get. But going through the process and educating them, they're really happy about it. But it underlines the point of today's topic, which is, you know, finding the right buyer, because I explained to that seller the dollar amount that comes up is the dollar amount. You've already told me the dollar amount is just a cherry on top for your retirement.
Yeah.
But if you can take a 25-year legacy and stay involved, rolling over that equity, you need to make sure that the group that is buying the business, you believe in them, that you think that they are the proper group to take it to the next level. And if you're going to invest in that group, they should be the right group. They should be the right buyer.
And I want to say this because I had this with a recent listing that I have under contract right now, where the buyer made a comment early in the process and said, you know, they were open to rollover equity too. And they wanted to make that part of their requirement for a buyer, that they definitely wanted to do rollover equity. And I had to tell them I wouldn't do that, because now we're going to take our buyer pool, and we're going to shrink it down very, very small. And then on top of that, then we have to find a company that's going to give us a good price, good terms, and is something that you'd want to invest in. It's good for you to say, hey, I'd be open to rollover equity with the right company in the right situation. But to make that a mandate to get the business sold, I just don't think you should do that up front.
Yeah, it's
it's another tool in the toolbox.
That's exactly right, and it's a great tool.
Yeah,
buyers want a seller that believes in their business, and they want someone that will bet on the come and throw up a piece of equity or a holdback. And you know, I don't want to get too deep into it today, but we had an item on here about the seller and owner financing effect and the right buyer. You know, if you're getting paid a portion of your proceeds that are getting held back at closing. For the buyer, it's again an insurance policy, but the seller needs to make sure that they believe that the buyer is the proper person to take over the company.
Yeah.
You know, if the business goes belly up, that note never comes
Gets paid.
And then there's a lot of times that note is tied to the performance of the business. Well, if the seller is no longer controlling the business or operating it and they have a seller's note, do you believe that that buyer is the best buyer to keep the business running? It's not just about getting to the finish line and putting money in your pocket. If you've held back money, A, be comfortable with the money you're getting up front.
Yep. Be happy when you get at the closing table.
And B, you better damn make sure that the group that's buying it, you feel comfortable with them. You trust them. They have the right expertise, and their game plan and their plans for the business become that much more relevant.
Yep. I agree. I'm just not going to add much to it because, you know, my stance.
I know where you're going.
I hate owner financing.
Yeah. There's only a couple more points, but you know, one of them was in finding the right buyer, you want to fit with the seller's personal goals post-sale. So I'll draw it back to the example I just gave about the seller who now wants to roll equity. And he had originally said, you know, I'm working 50, 60 hours a week. I don't want to do it anymore. And he said he wanted to retire. So, well, if you roll over your equity, what type of involvement do you want? Do you want to be a passive investor in the business and just be there as a consultant as needed? Do you want to stay involved in the business? And he said, you know, Carey, I want to get rid of my day-to-day responsibilities, and I want to help maintain the relationships that exist. And I've been doing this for 25 years. I have a really good outlook on where the business is going to go. So maybe I can just be an advisor. But he said, let's find the proper buyer first, and then find out what type of involvement I want to have. And I thought that was just a perfect full circle.
Carey, that's so funny because before we started this episode, I was talking to you about a business I'm taking to the market next week. It's going to be a little over 4 million. And I just talked to her this morning about that. There's almost the same exact conversation that you had. She wants to, I've already known this. I've known her, done the interview. She's great, but she reiterated this morning. She would love to stay involved with the business post-closing. She would love to be the salesperson for the company and do some coordination. I don't want to say what kind of business it is yet. And, but she wants to sell the business because she wants to take the majority of that pressure off of her back. You know what I mean? Because, you know, as a business owner, you're thinking about the business all the time. You wake up thinking about it. You go for a walk, you think about it. You're in the shower, you think about it. It's the last thing you think about before you go to bed, other than your family. And you think it's in your mind all the time. And, you know, it's good to sometimes just say, hey, I want to spend the last couple of years of my career being an employee and not having
not click run payroll, not getting the phone call at 2, 3 in the morning.
Yeah, whatever it is,
So
it's a lot to be a business owner.
It is. And, I'm talking with somebody right now that I'm mentoring that is just aspiring to be an entrepreneur. And I was like, the grass isn't greener always on the other side. And I gave some of the horror stories of running your own business. We both ran our own businesses outside of Boss Group. And I think perspective's everything, but being able to be vulnerable and open and have those conversations. But it makes so much sense for a business owner that's just like, I'm tired of running the show. I love this business. I want to be a part of it.
Yeah.
But I don't want to run the show anymore.
Look, owning your own business is one of the greatest things that you can do in your life. I mean, that's part of the American dream. I mean, I really believe that. And I think owning a business it's a fantastic experience. And I think I feel bad for people who go their whole life never owning their own business. But at the end of the day, after you've done it for so long, I can understand why business owners are like, yeah, I want to be involved in the business. I just don't want to be the guy.
I don't want to be the guy.
I don't want to be the guy.
So wrapping up, there's a couple more things that we had on here. Transition support and resources. If the buyer is coming in, they have an HR department and an accounting department, and they can source that. Maybe it throws extra money to the bottom line, or they just make running the business
There's some
easier.
kind of synergies between their existing company and the one that they're acquiring that makes them more money bottom line.
Just so many different things. But, I think it really comes down to alignment of values and vision. So we talked about work with people you like. Work with the buyer that has the best chance to get to the closing table, and work with the buyer that you want to work with long-term. Even if you're not attached to the business, you'll still have an attachment to your former employees, your clients, your vendors. So the long-term vision. So it's those three things, but I think it can all be summed up in when you sit down and you speak with a incoming buyer, look beyond the dollars, look beyond the terms, and look at the alignment of the values of either the large private equity group that's buying you or the individual that's transitioning to the American dream. Can you come to some commonality of how you treat people or how you look at capitalism and business and anything at all where you can create some type of getting on the same page, if you will, and feeling good about the transaction? I think if you took one thing from this episode, it's finding the right buyer is more than just...
And you'll get a good gut feeling. You know what I mean? Like we could sit here, we could have had this whole episode of like questions you should ask a buyer, but really, I think you as a seller will know what questions to ask, and you'll get a good gut feeling. But Carey, can I say something to our friends real quick?
Yeah.
I want to say this, 10 to 20% of businesses for sale out there actually sell. So 80 to 90% of the businesses on the market do not sell. What Carey and I wanted to get across in this episode, look, one is that if you're thinking about selling your business in the next couple of years, reach out to Carey or myself. We would love to talk to you. I'm telling you that if you talk to an experienced, seasoned broker that really knows what they're doing, and you talk to them a couple of years in advance, and they're not going to charge you, they can look at your financials and they can have conversations with you, and they can give you advice so that when you are ready to sell in a couple of years, that you are going to sell your business. You're going to be part of the 10 to 20% that actually sells. And we can help you get there. And on top of that, it's not about just getting your business sold. We want to go beyond that. We want to get your business sold for the best price we possibly can, the best terms we possibly can, and the correct buyer, a buyer that you like.
It's a perfect way to sum it up.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Boss Talk. We have another series coming. We're going to wrap up our first series now for the first 25 episodes, and we're looking forward to having you join us for the next 25.
Thank you very much.